do you set aside different reserves for co-living and long-term rentals? And I do. But basically, if I'm generating $2,000 a month in rental income on a long-term rental and 10% of that for maintenance and capital expenditures is $200, but now I'm generating $6,000 a month in co-living income, setting aside 10% of that is $600. So I'm setting aside 3 times the amount of money each month for maintenance and capital expenditures that I would be doing for a long-term rental, when in reality, that's excessive. You can a lot of the time reduce your reserves for your co-living properties. You could even leave it at, if it would have generated around $200 a month set aside for your maintenance and capital expenditures, you can leave it at that amount or somewhere in between. You don't need to do 10% of your new co-living income, but you can do it like somewhere in the middle. So if it would be 600 there, 200 for long-term rental, you can set aside 400, something along those lines where you set aside a little bit more because you might have a little bit more maintenance and capital expenditures, but it's not proportional. Just because your income went up 3 times does not mean your maintenance and capital expenditures will go up 3 times. Like your roof is still going to degrade over the same period of time. Maybe you have some more paint and drywall issues and little things like that. And then maybe you have a little bit more maintenance issues because you have more people there, but it's not usually going to be if your income is now 3 times the amount. It's not like your expenses will actually be 3 times the amount. So I've actually adjusted a little bit on how I set aside reserves, especially for maintenance and capital expenditures for co-living properties, somewhere in between the long-term rental estimate and then the co-living income. It does not need to be at the extreme, especially because once you have enough reserves set aside, you're setting aside, let's say $500 a month, right? You're setting aside $500 a month. Once you have, depending on the property size, $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 set aside in reserves, you do not need to keep setting aside reserves unless you go below that threshold, right? If you have over, like for a lot of our properties, if we have over 10, 15, or 20,000, depending on the property size, let's just say 20,000. If we have over 20,000 set aside in reserves for one property, we're going to just distribute that as income to the partners, like to ourselves as owners and then our capital partners in those deals. Otherwise, there's no point to just keep building your reserves 20,000, 30,000, 50,000. Like 20,000 will be able to offset the majority of things that will come up. You can rebuild that over time through setting aside more reserves, but you're not going to just forever set aside these reserves, especially at such a high rate, like $500, $600 a month. The funny thing is, like for long-term rentals, you're not even generating that much income. You're not even generating $500, $600 of long-term rental cash flow, but then to set aside that much for reserves is definitely excessive. For co-living, because you're generating so much more income and cash flow, you do need to set aside more maintenance and capital expenditures, those reserves, but there's a limit to how much you need, and you definitely don't need to set aside the same percentage as you would have if it was a long-term rental property. And that simple example, right? 200 for 600, 2,000 of income for 6,000 of income. It does not need to be 3 times the amount set aside for those reserves. I'm not saying fudge your numbers to make your deals work because you're just trying to make it, you're trying to offset the reserves, but be realistic and understand if you do not have reserves set aside and you have a property that needs more renovation, you guys are going to have to collectively put that money in. So that's why it's very important for you to have some savings set aside in addition to this, because if you don't have the reserves in a property, right, you only have 10,000, you need to spend 15,000, that 5,000 will have to come from you, or if you have capital partners, will have to come from between all of you. Do you set aside different reserves for co-living and long-term rentals? Cool. So let's talk about that. We have $2,450 in long-term rental income. Your reserves for this property, right? You have fixed expense of $245 for management. We're going to disregard property management. You have $196 a month for vacancy, and you have $245 a month for maintenance and capital expenditures. 8% towards vacancy, 10% for maintenance and capex. If you go to a different management strategy, so I kind of broke the calculator by doing that, but it's okay. All I got to do is we just fixed everything with that. Cool. So that's it. Now it's all done. I could literally copy paste this to the main one, but that's all done there. And just to clarify, right? We said for the reserves for the long-term rental is $441 a month, right? That includes $196 for vacancy at 8%, $245 for maintenance and capital expenditures at 10% of your long-term rental income. Well, if I go to a pad split or rent by the room, see if I have to zoom out a little bit, because my income has gone from $2,450 to $5,590. Well, this percentage for vacancy at 8% is $447, which is much higher, almost, let's say right around 2.5 times higher than what we saw there. And let's just see what this number is. So equals sum of, guys, if you don't know basic Excel, please learn that. It's going to be very helpful for you. So we were previously setting aside this. So this is for co-living, and this is for LTR. And then we were setting aside for long-term rental, it's the sum of these two, that 441. So you're setting aside equals, so we're setting aside 2.28 times the amount of reserves for the property. I would say the vacancy, that makes sense to do so because that is actually true. Like if you are missing out 8% of your income, whether it's long-term rental or short-term rental, because that's a percentage of the actual income, this one I wouldn't mess with. And if anything for co-living, what you'll see in certain markets is you're going to see this be at 10%. You're going to see a 90% occupancy or an 85% occupancy or an 80% occupancy. So this vacancy is going to go from maybe 8%, right, at 92% occupancy to 10% at 90% occupancy or 20% at a 80% occupancy. So this one I wouldn't mess with. I would adjust this based on the actual market that you're analyzing in. If you have not watched the video from last week where we literally find, analyze, and fund, like raise capital for a co-living rental, this is, I break it down. I literally show you how to find all this information. Please watch that video. It will answer all of that for you. And then in regards to maintenance and capital expenditures, this is where I vary reserves for co-living and long-term rentals. The maintenance and reserves or the property management, this does vary. That's because property management, if you're going through pad split, it's going to cost you between 10 to 12%. And you need your own management on the back end of that. Whether you're doing it yourself, you're hiring it out, you have an internal to your team. For me, it's at 5%. Some people will talk to property managers, they'll do it at 8%, 5%, 10%, flat fee. You have to figure out what that is for the markets that you're investing in. You have to build those connections with property managers to see what they'll do, or you self-manage it and at least pay yourself something so that you can replace yourself with someone else, which is what I did is I set aside the reserves, even though we self-managed it, so then I can hire someone to then do it. And I knew I could pay them from that. So like you stack 10 of these, right? You can pay someone almost $3,000 a month, right? 280 times 10, you could pay someone $3,000 a month to then do that back end management for you in your business, which is then exactly what I did. So, and the main one would be maintenance and CapEx. If we were to disregard the vacancy and just compare maintenance and CapEx, we have this one at 559, and then we have the co-living, or we have the long-term rental right here at 245. So you're basically, once again, setting aside 2.28 times. I don't think you need to set aside, in my personal opinion, I'm fairly conservative because I like to really analyze my investments and make sure there's a lot of wiggle room. But like, it's not like if one little thing goes wrong, everything will fold. But I also don't think you need to go to the extreme end and be so conservative with this piece that you set yourself up for failure by not being able to find any deals that make sense. So I think you don't need to set aside almost 2.3, we'll say, 2.3 times the amount of reserves for maintenance and CapEx, because you will not have 2.3 times the cost of, especially the capital expenditures piece. Like that piece alone is pretty much the same either way, right? Like if you got to replace the roof and this and that, it's going to have to happen anyway. Maybe your maintenance will be higher, but like 2 times as high, that's pretty extreme. And a lot of times you'll see your co-living rental income is 2 to 3 times the amount that your long-term rental income is. So with that being said, you can't see these numbers. So this is where I have the numbers for co-living right here. Okay, so the co-living maintenance and CapEx here, the 559, 245 from the long-term rental, that's 2.3 times your co-living. You're setting aside 2.3 times the maintenance and CapEx that you would be for a long-term rental. I think in reality, you can actually drop this to much lower, probably closer. So if we went 5%, you're going a little bit more than you were before. Maybe you go like 6%. So you're actually doing 1.5 times, something more reasonable, right? And then that will help you make deals work. But understanding that if and when the numbers do not work out in this scenario, like I wouldn't do this if you're not generating at least $1,000 a month in cash flow. I would only do it after you're generating that much cash flow, potentially to make the deal even better because of the fact that you are already setting aside tremendous amounts of money for the property. $300, $335 a month, or $3,600 for the year. That's a lot in reserves for maintenance and CapEx on a property. And if you are doing this well and you do lower this amount, that's one thing. You can drastically reduce this amount to even a lower percentage if when you are acquiring the property, you are already building more reserves up front. Sometimes to make your numbers work, that makes the most sense. Instead of setting aside $3,000 a year by setting aside $300 a month, right? Instead of setting aside $3,600 a year by setting aside $3,300 a month, or here, $4,000 a year, you can also raise a few years of this up front and see if that benefits your numbers. Right now, we see this at 1882 cash flow, 25% cash on cash return. You're adding, and that's setting aside $4,000 a month in maintenance and CapEx. What we can do is test out, well, if I reduce this to maybe half that amount, maybe 3%, that doesn't mean go crazy and do that without supplementing that some way. So if you're going to set aside $2,000 less each month, well, what if you set aside the next 5 years of reserves up front? So $10,000 more dollars, right? $2,000 times 5 years. If you raise $10,000 more dollars, would that be a benefit or a loss to your deal. In this instance, it was 25%, right? Cash on cash. We drop it down to 3%, it's 27. Well, we have to add that $10,000 up here. Now I'm kind of getting in the weeds of it, but this is good tactic for potentially negotiating your deals or seeing if they make more sense by restructuring. Instead of raising money or setting aside money each month, you set it aside at the very beginning. So it's actually a worse scenario. It's better to pull from the cash flow than it is in this specific scenario than it is to raise the $10,000 up front, right? You have to play around with that and see, does it make more sense to pull a lot each month, or does it make more sense to raise that in advance at the very beginning? In addition to that, that is the biggest area of difference in my reserves, is on the maintenance and capex for these higher income properties or higher income management strategies versus a long-term rental. I don't want this to be any lower. If I'm doing 245 for long-term rental, my maintenance and capex, I would not do like 4%, right? Because that is lower than my long-term rental. That is irresponsible. But if it's close to or above, that's fine. Maybe not right, like 1-to-1. This 1.1 is like you're basically setting aside the same amount, but maybe you set aside like 1.5 times. That is one big difference for me, is the maintenance and capex. Understanding that that extra half or an extra couple $100 a month, so extra $100 a month, is going more towards more maintenance issues, not really capital expenditures, not necessarily replacing your fridge as frequently or replacing your roof in particular or your flooring or whatever. Hopefully that makes sense. How do you manage utilities not coming too high? So that's another topic. I can talk about that. But one thing you can do is, well, for most long-term rentals, your tenants are the ones that are paying this. That's why it's not auto-filled. Most long-term, your tenants are paying their own utilities. Maybe you pay landscaping and all that. That's more of a fixed cost. When it's these types of utilities, if you are the one paying for it, like a midterm rental or co-living, it's a little tougher. You just have to account for that as part of your thing, that people are going to use a lot of utilities, right? That's, you set aside $600-700 a month for utilities alone. But for my midterm rentals, when it's one person in one unit, what I do is I will cover the cost up to X dollar amount for those utilities. For electric, water, trash, whatever, I'll cover $150 or $200 a month. Anything in excess of that, they'll be billed for it, right? So if I'm covering it, it's up to a certain dollar amount. If they're paying for it, I mean, it's up to them, whatever they do. If it's co-living, we have a lot of people in one property, it's hard to separate it. You can say that for the collective, right? Oh, if it's over $700, $600 a month for 6 people, right? It's $100 a person. But in reality, like, not everyone's using the same amount. I think it's more work than it's worth trying to handle it that way, like charge them back for anything in excess. It's better to understand. That's why it's really important to make your properties that are dependent on utilities and have a lot of people in them and vacancies and all that stuff, make sure you're setting aside good amount for your expenses, and then make sure that you have reserves set aside and that you're cash flowing a solid amount. If this goes up to 800, maybe it's not the 25% that you were going to get in return, but you're still getting a solid return and you're not dipping below. Like, you're not, if this was, let me just fake the number. So if this was like, let's say 2,500. Let's say even worse. If your monthly debt payments is $3,000 and you're only making $257 a month in cash flow, right? Well, this going up from 600 to 800 is disastrous. Like, that's terrible. You're almost literally losing money. It goes up to 900, you're literally losing money each month because you played it so close on your cash flow goal. Maybe on a long-term rental where your tenants are covering their own utilities, there's a lot less variability. Your taxes might adjust, your insurance might go up in value. Maybe you have to pay a landscaper an extra $25, $50, but there's not as much that is variable. When the variability comes from like utilities and maybe more longer vacancy and maintenance issues, don't play it too close. That's why I want at least $1,000 a month in cash flow, because if there is an issue, at least it's not going to wipe out all my cash flow or get me negative. That's my advice there. When you say, how do you manage utilities not coming too high? Understand that, okay, long-term rentals, primarily the tenants cover their own utilities, and the variability of that cash flow is very minimal. Like, whatever you anticipate you're going to get, you're going to be pretty close as long as you did your numbers right. You got your rental comps accurately, you got your insurance quote and all that stuff. You did the things accurately from the beginning. The variability that comes from utilities primarily affects, let's say, midterm rentals, short-term rentals, long and co-living. From a midterm rental rented by one individual, I give them a threshold how much utilities they can use that I'll cover, and then they will be charged for anything in excess. For co-living, when there's multiple people in one room or one house, right? Multiple rooms, each room being rented out to a different individual, and there's like 6 people living in this house. It's gonna be really hard to say, hey, I said 600, that's roughly $100 a person. How do you know who's using what? Then you have to charge each individual. That's a lot of work. Make sure that your numbers are so good on these deals that if this goes from 600 to 800, like it shouldn't go 600 to like 1,500, right? Like, that'd be crazy if you were off by $1,000 almost, but like maybe plus or minus a few $100 depending on seasonality. That is very viable. Make sure your deals will not be completely destroyed by that happening. That's where having that 15% cash on cash return and $1,000 of cash flow, it gives me a lot of wiggle room. Maybe the deal wasn't as perfect as I thought it was going to be up front, but at least we're not going into something disastrous. That's how you account for that.